Good morning, folks. We're going to be continuing our discussion about Kantian ethics here. We've already talked about Kant's concern with egoism. The reason why egoism is a hindrance to actual moral worth. And recall, one of the ways that he handles the problem of egoism is, even if our basic instinct is to be self-interested, he contends that we can overcome our egoism due to the fact that we possess reason, that we have the capacity for rationality. Now, the reason that reason is what can get us past our inherent egoism is actually more than twofold. Now, because we are rational beings, and this is a little bit differently from how the author explains it, we have the capacity for this. We have the capacity for abstract thought. Now, being able to think abstractly is what enables us to derive what? Because we can think abstractly, we are capable of discerning what Kant calls a moral law. And folks, this is probably a little bit of repetition, but his one absolute moral principle from which other principles derive is called the categorical imperative. More on that in a minute. Now, our capacity for rational thought is also what enables us, insofar as it's possible for us, to overcome our egoism. Now, how's that work? When I'm doing a moral deliberation, what I'm supposed to do is pretty much strip away everything about me that makes me me. The worst part of me, my passions, my emotions, the things that make me biased towards the people who I love, and the things that make me want to lash out against the people who I don't like. To think abstractly would mean to think of myself as a rational self, and take a guess how I'm supposed to think of all of you. Yeah, the same way. Rational beings. Strip away all of the things that lead to biases. Strip away all of the things that lead to selfishness. That is going to be the tool that will enable me to follow, at least as best as I humanly can, the moral law. Now, the categorical imperative, folks, recall that the author stated it in a more updated way. He talks about acting on those principles that are universalizable, which is just fancy Dan for saying, if you're going to say that it is a moral law, it applies not just to you, it applies to everybody, absolutely all of the time, no ifs and or buts. Now, the Kantian way of stating the categorical imperative, and by the way, folks, Kant wrote in German, so this is a translation from the German into English. The categorical imperative reads something like this. Act such that the maxim of your conduct could be willed to be a universal law of nature. Now, I might be repeating some things I've already gone over before, but it really does not hurt to drive the point home here. Now, remember that we've said that when Kant refers to maxims, a maxim refers to a rule that you give to yourself. Now, this is extremely important, that you give it to yourself. Because if you are merely obeying what someone else tells you to do, you are basically usurping your role in the part. You don't really deserve to be called a responsible agent then. It is key that you uncover the moral law yourself. You recognize why it's the moral law, and then you endeavor to do your best to follow the moral law. This drives the point home about what Kant sees as most valuable about what we call selves, individuals. You are rational beings with the capacity to discern the moral law from what fails to carry out the moral law. And that is why you are agents. And that is why we are justified in holding you morally accountable or having morally failed. This is what justifies his concept of responsibility. Now, the idea of willing it, I kind of already addressed when I talked about maxims. This act of willing it means that you have consciously made the choice. This is why some commentators on Kant have remarked, for the possibility of morality to have any meaning, human beings must, at least to some extent, be able to act with autonomy. I'll use the word that you guys might be more familiar with, free will. That's what we mean by autonomy, what a lot of people call free will. The ability to be self-legislating, to be self-regulating. If I were merely a biological robot, and by the way, current neurophysiology is starting to move in this direction. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Current neurophysiology is starting to move in this direction. Seeing that so many of the things that we think of as free choices about ourselves might just be biologically hardwired. Because we respond differently to the very same situations depending upon what chemicals are coursing through our bodies. Recent studies have been done on these things. And this stuff scares the crap out of some people because they think that it is diminishing this realm of moral freedom that we once thought we had. Many of us take for granted that we are able to freely choose our likes and dislikes. I don't think that's the case at all. I happen to think a lot of that's biological. A lot of it is socially conditioned into us. Peer pressure, things, things of this nature. Or I don't know about you, when it comes to things like music, I just like the way certain things sound. Other things, I just don't like the way they sound. I didn't choose my taste in music. I have a certain taste in music. You get the distinction? The same way with food. I don't choose to like certain foods. I like certain foods.
You can choose to like it.
No, you can choose to do it, but you can't really choose to like it. The same way that you can't really choose what you aesthetically like. Now keep in mind, when you say you can choose, the critic would say you're begging the question because you are assuming that we can make free choices. And that's what needs to be established. Kant contends that the only thing that we can actually freely probably choose is to divorce ourselves from our biases, because our biases actually make us not more free, but guess what? They make us less free. Those are the things that make us biological puppets. What enables us to be more than just a meat puppet is the fact that we are rational beings. Because as rational beings, we can step back. I'm speaking metaphorically, of course. We can look at the situation as if we were just an abstract rational being rather than the self and say, what should a rational being do? And if you figure out what a rational being should do, it's what you should do. It's also what who else should do. Everybody else. Yes, sir.
So you were talking about how our tastes are hardwired into our genes, if you will.
Well, they can be conditioned too.
So you have conditioning, and then you also have just maturity things, like the things that you enjoyed when you were younger change, when you're older. So that tells me that we have the ability to learn. We have the ability to change our wiring.
Well,
or maybe that changes.
Don't be too optimistic. I know why I like coffee as much as I do. I've been drinking it since I was 5 years old. I've been drinking it since I was 5 years old. I was encouraged to drink it because I suffered from pediatric asthma, and the amphetamines, or whatever the uppers are, caffeines, not amphetamines. Yeah, the chemicals in coffee, my parents believed, would legitimately help, my bronchial situation. So I drank coffee from that long. So for me, it's a habit. And you know what? I don't know if I actually like it. I drink it. I've come to enjoy the taste of good coffee. Of course, bad diner coffee, yeah. Give me a water, please. Yes.
So going back to the ability to reason and override certain biological factors or whatever factors could be conditioning factors, being to step back and abstract and look at what you're doing, what your choices are. Couldn't that see? Because when I was reading the chapter, I thought you could always sit there and say that goes back to something else. That choice to be able to be abstract could go back to some other sort of conditioning. So then it would stand to reason that we don't actually have a choice because we were conditioned to do that.
Gee, do you hear what Mr. White's asking? Yeah, the critic might say of Kant that just reading Kant could be considered a conditioning agent. And by the way, many of us are brought up to be vaguely Kantian in our thinking, whether or not we've heard about Kant or not. Because whenever you hear that phrase, doing the right thing for the right reasons, well, what that translates into is we want to know what the person's motive is. We would like to know that they did it because it was the moral thing to do, rather than that they were going to get a pat on the back for it, or rather because they wanted to get a crown in heaven from God for behaving well, when they really wanted to be bastards. You get the idea? If you're merely doing it because of the rewards, it is most of our impression that we don't truly deserve the same amount of credit. Now, there's a reason why, and some of you actually talked about this in your homework. There is a reason why we don't see any problem with our children not having the moral motive, and it's because they're not agents yet. We recognize that with children, to get them to do the right thing, we need to put a carrot in front. It's usually not a carrot for children. That's, of course, the metaphor. Might be a chocolate bar, might be a pat on the back. I was highly susceptible to praise. Yeah. Wanting to win the affection of your mom and dad. Sounds very Freudian. I won't talk any more about that, though. But yeah, sounds very Freudian. Now, of course, the hope is that if the child begins to do the right thing, even if it's not for a moral motive, that eventually when she hits the age of reason, that she will be able to recognize what is doing the right thing for the right reason, not simply because of the rewards that you're going to get from it. Now, folks, I am no pie-eyed optimist, and neither is Kant. He recognized that some people will go through all of their life, never performing a truly moral action. Many people will not get past that childish phase of moral development. Now, for those of you who have discussed Lawrence Kohlberg in another course, psych class, he was the guy who, he was from Harvard, who did the study on moral development in children. Now, his judged highest stage of moral development was what I would call a Kantian stage. If you're merely being obedient because of what can happen to you, that's not truly moral. If you're only doing things because of what you can get out of the bargain, those are pre-moral phases. His highest phase is very much like the Kantian phase. Acting in accordance with a principle. Now, of course, key is having the right principle, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, according to Kant, the fundamental overarching principle, the abstract one, is called the categorical imperative that I have right here. the specific principles that flow from it that apply to particular situations, he calls, and this is in the notes, these are called hypothetical imperatives. And just to repeat something I said before, he calls them imperatives because an imperative statement is a command. Now, it's not somebody else commanding you, it's reason commanding you. So in effect, these moral commands are commands that rational agents ought to be giving to themselves. Now, one of Kant's most famous hypothetical imperatives is he contends that no rational being could will promise breaking. And here's how it goes. Whenever you will a lie, folks, take a guess what you're in effect doing. You're willing that the lie be the universal behavior. Now suppose you're in a situation where if you tell a lie, and this is what many people consider to be a moral lie, Kant believes there's no such thing. If you tell a little white lie in order to save a person's feelings, many people think that's the right thing to do. They say, what harm could it do? And besides, if the outcomes of telling the lie will be to save a person you care about's feelings, you ought to do it. Kant says quite differently. Because when you tell a lie in any particular situation, you're basically willing that anybody tell a lie anytime they think they need to get themselves out of the soup. Now, notice that I said get them out of the soup. Because Kant was well aware of our potential for egoism, he understood that you're telling that little white lie to save a loved one's feelings. You really might just be doing for whom? For yourself, because you don't want to deal with the consequences of telling an uncomfortable truth. So in other words, what you might think is an altruistic lie anyway might not even be an altruistic lie. It really might be to save yourself the trouble of hurting someone's feelings. Because it is trouble. There are ramifications. Now, there's one other thing that the author of the text gets to more deeply into the second Kantian chapter. But in order to give this more meaning, I'm going to have to mention it. At the back of all of Kant's ethics, and folks, this is actually what many people consider to be the more important formulation of the categorical imperative. It's what the author of our text calls Kant's principle of dignity. Now, Kant contends that all rational beings possess this thing called dignity, inherent worth, intrinsic value. Now, you each have value, not because of your particularity. You possess value because of the fact that you are rational and you can recognize and try to obey the moral law. It's not because you can feel pain. It is not because you are a child of God. I mean, I'm giving you all these reasons that people might give for believing that humans have intrinsic worth. Kant says the reason we have intrinsic worth is because we are rational beings, capable of recognizing and doing our best to endeavor to follow the moral law. Now, this dignity principle that the author talks about is framed this way in Kant. And admittedly, this sounds excessively fancy Dan. And that's why the author probably doesn't lay it on you Kant's way. Never treat your fellow rational beings as a mere means. Never treat your fellow rational beings as a mere means. Always treat them as ends in themselves. Ends in themselves? What the heck does that mean? Well, to say that a rational being is an end in itself is basically to say that you have value simply on the basis that you are a rational being. To use another person as a means would be to treat them as a thing, an object. To say that you ought to treat other people as ends in themselves basically means treat them as rational beings that have value. The same value as what? Yeah, the same value as you've got. Now, folks, this is a very tall order, and some of you actually talked about this in your homework. Indeed, this is a tall order. And Kant was well aware that this was a tall order. And critics have noted that in order to treat some people as ends in themselves, guess what you may have to do sometimes? I go further, treat some people as means. Not because you want to, but because the real world makes it so. Because the conditions of reality. So this is why perhaps the best we can do is to think of this as a regulative ideal. Do the best you can to treat your fellow rational beings as ends in themselves. And you're ends in yourselves because you all possess rationality. Not because of the reasons that religion might give, not because of the reasons that a utilitarian would give, but on the grounds that we are rational beings. Now, before I talk about Huckleberry Finn and Heinrich Himmler, they're mentioned in the text, I do want to give you one more example of a Kantian hypothetical imperative. He talks about this in a famous passage of his called The Four Illustrations. The second one on his list was promise breaking, which I just talked about. He also contends that no rational being could will suicide. Now, here's the gist of his argument. He says, suppose that a person is very, very depressed. He feels that his life has no meaning and purpose. So he thinks to self, should I off myself or should I not? He says that if he were to say yes, he would be basically willing, not just the destruction of himself as a being that has value. He would be willing the dismantling of all humanity. Because if you will the ending of your own life when you're depressed, you're basically willing that anybody do that when they're depressed. He says that would not be rational. That would be irrational. Now, one little caveat here. Remember that I said, suppose that he were being rational. Kant is well aware that most people who are contemplating suicide are not in a position to be completely rational about it. Because they can't get their bad emotions out of the way. Yes?
So then, bridging lying and suicide together, I understand this sounds crazy on the surface. Wouldn't it make it morally justifiable to lie to either keep yourself from committing suicide or for someone else committing suicide?
I don't want to cheat ahead here. We will talk in a very nearby upcoming chapter about the way that Kantians would deal with real-life moral dilemmas in order to intend to do the right thing. But of course, the means to doing so might not look moral. We will be talking about what are called the doctrine of double effect when we do a later chapter. The doctrine of double effect will be a strategy that Kantians will use to try to mitigate the kind of situations that Mr. White is talking about. In other words, I intended to save a person's life. My intent was to save a person's life. Now, the means that you may have to do in order to save that person's life might mean telling a little white lie. But remember, for Kant, it's not about thinking about the consequences, it's thinking about the intent. Mr. Yassalonis, you had a question.
Yeah, so I don't remember really where I picked this up, but the idea is that there's generally two means to get to like suicidal thought. And the one is completely irrational. I'm depressed. I don't want to live like this anymore. Life will never be good again. And then the rational thought, completely rational thought, would be, I'm 80 years old. There isn't enough food here for everybody. And if I kill myself, then the younger generations will have more food for themselves.
Well, admittedly, did you hear his comment? He was making distinctions about different kinds of suicide. The kind of suicide that Kant was specifically talking about was, the depressed person. Admittedly, and we'll talk about this when we talk about physician-assisted suicide and what is called euthanasia. The question is euthanasia the same situation as a depressed person endeavoring to end his life? The answer is, I would say no. They are not the same thing.
But what I said was actually completely different from euthanasia.
Oh.
Because
Oh yeah, you're talking about the person, in some other cultures where resources were scarce, it was custom among the very, very old to go out into the ice and expose themselves, sacrificing their own life for the good of the society. And by the way, similar societies would also, if they had children they couldn't care for, they would commit infanticide at infancy. And by the way, they considered the infanticide not as woohoo infanticide. They considered it a small mercy, because they believed that the child, if the child would have continued, would have endured more hardship than not. And too many mouths to feed would end up doing what? Basically destroying that small society that barely had enough to get by as it was. So in other words, their intent might actually be able to be framed, strangely enough, in a Kantian way, even though what? Even though the means are ugly. Even though the means are ugly. In other words, our intent was not to wantonly kill. Our intent was to save the most lives.
That sounds very utilitarian.
Well, and that's going to be and I'm talking too much about this because this is going to be the subject of a later chapter. But yeah, the fact is, many people will say that these sound like Kantian ways of basically trying to do the same thing as a utilitarian would, but dressing it up in Kantian garb. In other words, they think that it is rhetorical sleight of hand and nothing more. I hope I answered your question all right. Now, folks, I do want to talk about something that the author doesn't, and it's also not in my notes, and it's one of the reasons I'm adding on to this recording here. In order to try to contrast, and I know one of you have heard a version of this before, in order to contrast a Kantian approach with the utilitarian approach, many young, or I should say, my children had to do one of these lifeboat ethics activities in high school. Maybe they had to do one of these lifeboat ethics. Okay, you got a lifeboat. It holds 7 people. And you only have enough food for 7 people. Now remember, when you do these thought experiments, you have to do what? You have to suspend judgment and accept it on its terms. Now, you're usually given something like 10 or more people. And of course, your decision has to be what? Who do you gotta sacrifice? Which individuals won't get a spot on the lifeboat? Now, it's very clear that the utilitarian approach would say there is nothing inherently wrong with making sacrifices. As a matter of fact, sacrifices need to be made in order to do what? In order to do the greatest good. So you would have to calculate which people would be more valuable overall for the society. And guess what students are always given? They're always given a list of 10 people who are very different from one another in terms of experience, skills, ethnicity, and other kinds of backgrounds. Yeah, age, and of course, among the first people thrown out of the lifeboat are the people who are old and or infirm. She was old and she would have died anyway, is sort of the excuse there. We're not happy about letting her die. Notice we didn't say killing her. We said letting die. We're not happy about letting her die, but these things need to be done. By the way, people's racial biases sometimes come in here too. Because, you know, white people sometimes make racist assumptions. Just listen to them. Boy, this is, here I am, middle-aged white guy talking about white people. But yeah, very frequently, racist assumptions are exposed when we do these lifeboat ethics kinds of things. Because many people are taught to value clergy people, simply because the dude's got a collar, he's got a spot on the lifeboat. Even though some of us believe, what about the clergy? Yeah, I'm admitting my bias here. Those are people society might be better off without. Because I don't know that religion has done a hill of beans when it comes to overall good in the world. I've been to churches where hate was preached from the pulpit. I've been to churches where hate was preached from the pulpit. Now, of course, I'm making generalizations here, just like everybody does. And that's sort of the problem even with being a quote-unquote good Kantian or a good utilitarian. Frequently, people with very high-level skills are the ones who get a spot in the lifeboat, doctors and so forth. Children almost always get a spot in the lifeboat. And this has nothing to do with utilitarianism. Even though you're supposed to think like a utilitarian, it has to do with an outgrowth of natural law ethics. Because children are seen as untapped potential that deserve their chance. This is why the old person is seen as already having had his or her chance, as well as being a potential drag on the lifeboat. Think the Poseidon adventure kind of stuff. Yeah, they won't let the old lady die.
Oh,
Now, how do you think that Kant would handle the lifeboat? Because for Kant, remember, and I want to drive this home, ultimately, it amounts to fairness. That's the way the author of the text, sort of boils down Kant's principle, because we all have the same amount of inherent value. So you could not do the lifeboat like a utilitarian would. A strict Kantian would likely have to, I was going to say draw lots. Mr. White's got it. In other words, draw straws. Make it radically fair. Because each and every one of us has the exact same amount of dignity. So it would be unfair and immoral to throw someone out of the lifeboat simply because they were an old part. It would be wrong to throw someone out of the lifeboat simply because we might have racial bias against them or something of this nature. It would be wrong. Yeah, oh, by the way, there's almost always an ex-con in here. And he already had his chance. He's shown what kind of man he is. Isn't that exactly what happens in Batman the Dark Knight? When all of the supposedly good people are all ready to blow up the ferry boat that has a bunch of convicts. And of course, Christopher Nolan, he's crafty here. He plays on our puppet strings. He has the most moral Kantian guy on board is a guy wearing, a prison fatigues or whatever they call it. Yeah, he's the most moral guy. He throws the thing out. He says, if they're going to blow us up, they'll blow us up. He says, but I ain't doing it. And I'm not going to give you guys the choice. But yeah, it turns out that the best Kantian on board, was one of the cons. Yeah, if you haven't seen it, it's the best of those Batman movies as far as I'm concerned. The Christopher Nolan ones. Yeah, it has Heath Ledger as the Joker. You can't beat that guy as the Joker. But anyway, there's one other thing. Guess what a good Kantian also might be willing to do? A good utilitarian might also be willing to do the same thing.
Ask everybody if they choose to stay.
Yeah, or I'll go you one further. I would be willing to sacrifice myself. And by the way, that would be a problem if they were all good Kantians, because everyone would be willing to sacrifice themselves. Yeah, and then we'd be back to drawing straws. And then we would be back to drawing straws. Now, a good utilitarian would be willing to sacrifice himself. However, if he is a person with high value skills, he would have to do the not so comfortable thing and say, well, you know what? I do have these high level skills that will be worthwhile in society afterward. I would rather sacrifice myself, but I think that you guys would be better off with me. Now notice one of the problems here. Unlike Kant, utilitarianism makes judgments about the value of human beings in terms of their utility. The differently able person would be thrown off right away. You're aware of this. The differently able person would be thrown out right away. The person with subpar intelligence would be thrown out right away. Yes.
So with people that have subpar intelligence and children, people that can't objectively look at the situation or rationalize, you're then putting a premium on your life for whatever reason or someone else's life by saying that you have more reason to be there just because of those skills, whatever. So then,
because it always comes down to the greatest good for the utilitarian.
but in the Kantian aspect, a child can't sit there and rationalize and say, okay, well, I'm going to self-sacrifice so other people can have life. So wouldn't it make it more your responsibility to do that?
Well, and I will come back to this later. And this is because, for those of you who read all the chapters, you do understand that a strictly Kantian account would give us no reason to treat certain individuals with dignity. Pre-moral agents, the differently abled, and animals. Well, the Kantian would actually say, yes, we have a duty to those children because they are not yet moral agents yet. But guess what? In soon enough time, they will be agents too. This is why we deserve to treat them as if they already are agents. Because they are potential rational beings.
Is that what he was talking about with moral community? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Yeah, this is why children, even though they're not agents yet, and this might sound a stretch, but we would count them as fully fledged dignified beings, even though they are not just yet. Now, of course, Kant would have a bigger problem with the mentally challenged, and he certainly wouldn't have a chance with our good fellow primates, who are very similar to us in so many ways. But there's no way in Hades that animals could have any kind of moral standing under a strict Kantian analysis. And I'll talk about that more when we get to the next part of the lecture. Now, before we leave this part of the lecture, do keep in mind that Kant frames morality as a duty. And this is in part because once you recognize the moral law, you have discovered that it is your duty to follow the moral law. But there's another reason for it. If you don't think of it as a duty, you might be letting egoism creep into your motivation. This is why it might be a problem. If you desire to do it too much, you might be getting too much out of the bargain. Now, he's not saying that it's a bad thing to feel good for doing the right thing. However, if your reason for doing the right thing is because of the good feeling, it might undermine your actually deserving the proverbial moral gold star. Now, the author of the text comes back to this discussion about to behave morally, according to Kant, in part means to act with integrity. Now remember, To act with integrity means to behave consistently. And Kant would add, to behave consistently in the way the moral law would have you behave. Now, the author of the text mentions here the problem of things like dedicated Nazis. And I'll give you two examples. Adolf Eichmann's defense was that he was merely following orders. In other words, it wasn't me being motivated by it. It wasn't me really doing it. It was really just me carrying out what was my duty. He acted with integrity, but most of us would say acting with integrity wasn't enough. Himmler, he was one of Hitler's top guys. Himmler acted with integrity towards the Nazi plan. But guess what? He got nothing whatsoever out of it if you've heard anything about his diaries. Jonathan Bennett talks about it in an essay where he talks about both Himmler and the character Huckleberry Finn. For those of you who are interested, I've attached that essay to the Kant file in D2L. And this is partly because this essay was in previous editions of The Ethical Life. It is well worth checking out. Himmler acted with integrity to try to carry out the final solution at great personal cost. How do you know? What does he mean by great? And by the way, he's not suggesting you have sympathy with Himmler. Don't misread me or Bennett here. We're not saying, oh, poor Himmler. But Himmler suffered a nervous breakdown. He ended up with all kinds of pills to deal with his anxiety and depression because he was acutely aware of what he was doing. He had convinced himself that he was doing the right thing, not just for the good of Germany, but for the good of the future of civilization. He believed that people like him had to pay a great price to do it. In other words, he suffered greatly. He was feeling no joy in it. He certainly had integrity, but we certainly would not praise him for it, because we would say that he was following immoral principles. No, we do say he was following immoral principles. Now, this is where Bennett gets into a conversation about Huckleberry Finn and integrity. And he specifically refers to the incident where Huck and Jim, they're on their makeshift raft, and Huck is out and about, and Jim is back near the raft, near the bushes. And sure enough, Huck comes upon some slave bounty hunters. Now, of course, they're trying to round up slaves and return them and get bounties for them. They ask Jim who is over there on the raft. Jim, he doesn't say that it's Jim. He lies to the slave bounty hunters. And Huck is troubled by this. Because number one, he's been told lying ain't a good thing. Now there's another reason. Huck is a young person. So he's still confused about things, and many adults are confused about this. He equates the law of the land with morality here. He says, I know that Jim is the property of poor old Mrs. Watson. He says, and I did a really bad thing to Mrs. Watson because she wants her property back. He says, but there was just something inside of me that wouldn't let me do it. Aw, shucks, damn me to hell then. Oh, I'm paraphrasing. I'm trying to play Hawk out of Mark Twain. He says, aw, shucks then, damn me to hell. In other words, he thinks that he has failed to do the moral thing because he's not abiding by the law, and he lied. His gut told him that the right thing to do was to protect Jim. Because something within him probably enabled him to see it, at least partly in a Kantian way. Jim's a human being, not a piece of property. And I'm going to go beyond Bennett. Bennett doesn't talk about this in his essay. I happen to think that Huck actually was acting with integrity. It's not integrity to the law of the land. He was acting out of integrity towards a promise he made to Jim. He promised Jim that he would help him to get to freedom. In order to keep that promise, what did he have to do? He had to lie to a bunch of scumbag slave bounty hunters. Now, of course, there are people, the slave bounty hunters were people trying to profit off of an immoral system. I'm talking like me, not Huck at this point. Now, the fact is, you still have a duty to do what is moral. But some of us happen to believe that people who aren't even trying to be moral don't deserve to be treated with dignity. Because to some extent, they've done what? They've just given half the peace sign to the moral law. They have made themselves outsiders to morality, wantonly immoral. Whether or not they were conditioned to be that way or not, the issue is they have the capacity to see the immorality of slavery, as so many Americans did. Some of them gave up their lives to try to get rid of the scourge. You may not have agreed with his means, but some of us think that John Brown was a hero. He was the man who tried to foment a slave rebellion because it was the abomination. Yeah, I'll go on record saying that I think he was a hero. Even though at the time he was considered to be crazy. Why? Because he believed in the equality of the races, which made him crazy at the time. And he was also willing to die for the cause. Now notice, we don't think people who are willing to die for a cause that we like are crazy. But we tend to think people willing to die for a cause that we don't agree with are crazy. In other words, our biases are what lead to those judgments about what's worth living for and what's dying for. I'm running out of time. I do also want to mention here, do keep in mind, if I haven't already driven this home enough, that for Kant, the moral law is absolute and unchanging. No ifs, and, or buts. Now, I've already said I'm going to talk about Kant's notion of a human being a little more in the second half. Now, I don't think I need to recap the hypothetical and categorical imperatives here, because guess what? I just talked about that extensively a few minutes ago. Now, I've already talked today about Kant's concept of a person. Moral agents are so because they have the potential, or they are rational beings. It is our rationality that enables us to recognize the moral law, and it also is what gives us what capacity we have for acting with autonomy. I equated that with the commonplace concept of free will. It is partly because of our ability to recognize the moral law and our ability to freely choose the moral law. These are the things that give human beings dignity. This is why, according to Kant, animals do not possess dignity. But more on that in a few minutes. Now, folks, we've already kind of talked about the goodwill. The goodwill is what we might refer to as something like the rational intention to try your best to follow the moral law. Now, folks, I wish that Kant hadn't called it the goodwill, because people who don't read carefully about it might miss the point. A goodwill is not empathy, it is not fellow feeling, it is not concern. A goodwill I would prefer it if he had called it this. I wish that he had just simply called it the rational will. Because for him, rationality and goodness are correlates. Because it's the rational being who endeavors to do the good. And it is the good person who is doing her best to see things as rational beings universally should. Now, it is only when we're acting with the rational intention, called the good will, that we actually deserve to be given credit for doing the moral thing. Because if there are any other intentions involved, we just might be acting out of egoistic motives. I think we made that clear. Now, folks, I've already talked about what is referred to in the text as the principle of humanity. The principle of humanity is tied to what other word that I've already used that starts with a D? Yeah, it equates with the idea of dignity. Now, Kant contends that because human beings possess dignity, we all possess inherent worth. We have intrinsic value. He uses this phrase of what he calls the kingdom of ends. The kingdom of ends means to promote the community of all rational beings. Now, like so many idealistic thinkers, Kant was a quasi-utopian. He understood that a perfect society was not possible because we are not perfect, nor are we perfectly rational. However, he believed that if more and more people were to endeavor to follow the moral law, that we could get much closer to an ideal, perfect world, insofar as it's possible. So the end game here is that morality is supposed to foster things that have inherent worth. Human beings. By the way, folks, you probably already guessed why those with a Kantian perspective will, in general, not be fans of abortion. Kingdom of ends. Multiplying human beings, rational beings, things of intrinsic value, is a good thing from a Kantian point of view. Just wanted to throw that in there. Now, the author talks about some problems associated with the principle of humanity, and this is sort of the last part of the conversation. He talks about the fact that treating others as an end in themselves might be a bit vague. What does it mean to treat someone as an end? Well, I'd say that it's not all that vague. It means to treat other people insofar as you can as human beings, not as things. Now, admittedly, it's not easy to do, but I think most of us understand what he means by treating human beings as ends in themselves. So I'm not too big on that criticism. Now, Kant also talks about justice as fairness. So keep in mind, his advice when it comes to the right kind of punishment means giving people their just deserts. You better know this, folks. When it came to cases where a person committed murder one, Kant was a proponent of lex talionis. This will show up again. Lex, that's Latin for law. Talionis, claw, talons. Literally the law of the claw. It translates to what everyday English phrase? An eye for an eye. Now, Kant was a proponent of giving people what they deserve. In other words, his position on punishment was not behavioral. his position on punishment was giving people what they deserve. Now, what Kant contends is that the only fair deserts for a person who intentionally destroys another human life is to have that life extinguished. Now, I want to make this clear because the author doesn't have a chance to talk about it in this chapter. It will be talked about in our essays concerning capital punishment moving forward. Most of my extended family who are capital punishment, yeah! Most of them are not Kantian in any sense in their support of capital punishment. Does anyone know what I mean by that? They get excited. They actually wish they could be the one who chops off the head or presses the button or administers the lethal injection. In other words, they keep saying, we want justice to be served, but when they say justice, they really mean what? Yeah. They really mean revenge. If your motive for being a proponent of capital punishment is revenge, you are probably just as immoral as the person committing murder. Well, maybe not as immoral, but close. Because your desire is to get even. If you take too much pleasure in it, you just might be a sadist, not a person who values human beings. Now, this is the side of Kant's argument that the author talks about. And many people find it to be counterintuitive. Kant's reason for believing that lex talionis is just punishment for the perpetrator is because it respects the dignity of the perpetrator. He's not doing it out of respect for the victims. He's saying that executing the capital murderer actually respects the dignity of the murderer. Any lesser punishment would fail to do so. Because if you decide to say, oh, let's take it easy on the guy and let him off the hook in some way, you would be basically saying that he was not fully human. So you affirm his dignity by giving him what he deserves. You affirm his dignity by giving him what he deserves. Yeah.
Okay, I'm really struggling with this because murder is one thing, but I can say that I completely disagree, but I also don't want to sit there and say this because I firmly believe that a child rapist or someone that reprehensible doesn't really deserve life. That's just my personal opinion. I'm not saying that.
No, he's saying the same thing.
Yeah. No, I get that.
I mean, he is in a sense suggesting that giving people what they deserve might sound extremely heinous, but to give people what they deserve is in a sense to show them what? You have disrespected the dignity of another human being.
So let's disrespect yours?
No.
It's not.
As a matter, no, I'm not saying I agree with Kant, but what Kant is suggesting is that it is fair. It is fair and just to take away the life of a person who has wantonly denied somebody else the right to life. Now, I'm talking that's 20th century language for it. It is the only fair way to do it. Now, what the author means by giving unclear advice is, you might think it makes sense for things like murder one. But if you apply lex talionis to, say, the rapist, take a guess what lex talionis might amount to. Yeah, raping the rapist in prison.
That's what I'm saying.
Now, by the way, I think that there are plenty of people who would like to see things like that happen. But it's not because they care about justice. They want to see Jerry Sandusky suffer like his victims did. You get what I mean? That's not what Kant is talking about by justice. Because justice is supposed to be done with no emotion at all. It's not something that you want to do. It's something that you believe is the right thing to do. This is why most people do not want justice. They want blood or whatever. Hold that thought 1 second. Now, don't need to talk about number 3 too much. Let me read it. It says, the principle assumes that we are genuinely autonomous, and it's unclear if that is truly the case. I don't need to talk about that anymore, because I already talked about some of the reasons why some people dispute that human beings actually have free will. We already had that conversation. Now, the author also says, moral luck challenges the idea that one only deserves credit or blame for what they can control. Now, what the author means is something like this. In many cases, the person tries their darndest to follow moral law, but things don't turn out well. And because of moral lack of luck, that person might end up getting blamed simply because of the way things turned out. And this is because our intentions can't really what? We can't truly know anybody's intentions. So the person might get moral blame for something they don't deserve to be blamed for. And moral luck sometimes has it that if somebody is doing something that is in conformity with what the moral law would dictate, but they had the wrong intentions, we might endeavor to give them a moral gold star, even though they really didn't deserve it. Now, last point. This we've already talked about a little bit. Kant's account of human dignity, and aka the principle of humanity, fails to explain why those who lack rationality and autonomy also deserve respect. Now, I talked already about how Kant would try to explain why we ought to treat children as if they had dignity, even though they are not quite rational beings yet. The only thing that a Kantian might be able to do when it comes to the mentally challenged might be to use this kind of rhetorical gymnastics. Yes, they are human beings. However, because of bad accidents of DNA, they are incapable of being fully fledged moral agents. We should still treat them with dignity. Oddly enough, and this is going to be the same reason that he says we shouldn't mistreat animals. Because if we get used to treating beings without dignity like garbage, it's not a far step that we might start to treat beings with dignity like garbage. Yeah. And this is why Kant was not an advocate. He's not a guy you would want to use for your animal rights paper. You would want to use him for the non-animal rights side. Because he contends that animals do not possess intrinsic value. But he didn't advocate kicking dogs. Because if you get accustomed to abusing animals, it's not a far step to start doing that to rational beings. Now, the reason why animals don't possess intrinsic worth is because they are not rational beings. Because they are not rational beings. It doesn't follow that we ought to treat them like dirt, though. Because decent people would treat living things with decency.
That's based off of our limited knowledge of what animals are. I mean, we can barely contemplate our own existence
Well,
on theirs.
And just to jump off of what Mr. White is talking about, I was listening to a piece on NPR yesterday on a TED Talk. It was a TED Talk about a fellow who was working for, I guess we might call it the legal emancipation of animals. Because he was arguing cases for some of our primate friends who basically possess concepts of self, that have abilities to think about and reason about things. They can recognize when they're being incarcerated, but nonetheless, chimpanzees and other primates are frequently kept in inhumane prison-like conditions, even though they didn't do anything except for being a chimpanzee. But yeah, a strict Kantian account would give us no reason to think that animals are deserving. However, the more that we actually study some of our animal friends, we might find out that they might be more deserving of dignity than we previously thought. Yeah. Well, have a nice day, and you ask questions if you got them.